Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Tallahassee history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1849, the city of Tallahassee stood as Florida's capital, a sprawling plantation society built upon the backs of enslaved labor. The rolling hills of Leon County stretched endlessly, dotted with grand estates and modest homesteads alike. It was here, amid the Spanish moss and red clay roads, that a mystery would unfold, one that would haunt local records for generations to come. The Granger plantation occupied nearly 800 acres along the Meridian Road, approximately 12 miles northeast of the Capitol building. Elias Granger, 28 years of age, had inherited the property from his father 3 years prior. Unlike many plantation owners of his generation, Granger was known for his quiet demeanor and scholarly pursuits. Neighbors often remarked that he spent more time in his library than overseeing field operations, leaving much of the daily management to his overseer, Thomas Wickham. The Rousseau family had arrived in Tallahassee in 1847, refugees from the political upheaval in France. Henri Rousseau, a former merchant from Lyon, had brought with him his daughter, Evangeline, then 19 years of age. They had purchased a modest home on Calhoun Street, near the center of town, using what remained of the family's European assets. Evangeline Rousseau quickly became known in local social circles for her education and refined manner of speech, though some whispered about the family's reduced circumstances. According to records maintained by St. John's Episcopal Church, Elias Granger and Evangeline Rousseau first met during a Christmas social in 1848. Reverend William Morrison noted in his personal correspondence that the young woman seemed to captivate the normally reserved plantation owner. By spring of 1849, their courtship had become the subject of considerable local interest. What made their relationship particularly noteworthy was not merely the difference in their social positions, though Henri Rousseau's financial struggles were well known, but rather the unusual circumstances surrounding their meetings. Unlike typical courtship patterns of the era, Elias and Evangeline were frequently seen together in locations far from the usual social venues. Samuel Porter, who operated a general store on Monroe Street, later testified that he had observed the couple walking together along the old Indian trail that ran through the forest north of town, always in the late afternoon hours when shadows grew long. Margaret Whitfield, whose family owned the neighboring plantation, recorded in her diary that she had noticed lights in the abandoned Hartwell cabin, which sat on the boundary between the Granger and Whitfield properties. The cabin had been vacant since 1846, when the previous tenants had moved west. Mrs. Whitfield wrote that on several occasions during the summer of 1849, she observed two figures approaching the cabin just before sunset. The Hartwell cabin itself was a modest structure, built from local pine and featuring a single large room with a stone fireplace. Records from the Leon County tax assessor indicate that the building had fallen into disrepair, with loose shutters and a sagging roof. Local children avoided the area, claiming they heard strange sounds emanating from within, though their parents dismissed such tales as typical childhood imagination. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, who served as the community's physician, noted in his medical journal that during the summer months of 1849 he had been called upon twice to treat Evangeline Rousseau for what her father described as episodes of nervous exhaustion. The young woman complained of sleeplessness and what she termed visions that came to her during twilight hours. Dr. Hayes prescribed laudanum and complete rest, but noted that Miss Rousseau seemed reluctant to discuss the specific nature of her distress. The first documented indication that something unusual was occurring came through a letter discovered decades later in the archives of the Florida Historical Society. The letter, dated July 15, 1849, was written by Evangeline Rousseau to her cousin Marie in New Orleans. In it, she described meeting someone who understood the weight of secrets and the burden of carrying knowledge that could not be shared with others. The letter mentioned midnight conversations and the discovery of documents that revealed truths about the past that certain families preferred to keep buried. Henri Rousseau grew increasingly concerned about his daughter's behavior during this period. According to the account books he maintained, he hired Mrs. Catherine Mills, a local widow, to serve as a companion for Evangeline. Mrs. Mills later told Reverend Morrison that the young woman would often disappear for hours at a time, claiming she was visiting friends. But when Mrs. Mills inquired with these supposed friends, none reported seeing Evangeline during those periods. The plantation records from this time show an interesting pattern. Thomas Wickham, the overseer, noted several instances of slaves reporting strange occurrences in the fields closest to the Hartwell cabin. Workers claimed to hear voices carrying across the cotton fields late at night, though when investigated, no source could be identified. More troubling were reports that some of the enslaved individuals had begun leaving food near the cabin, claiming they were instructed to do so by someone they would not name. By August of 1849, the relationship between Elias Granger and Evangeline Rousseau had attracted the attention of Tallahassee's more prominent families. Mrs. Adelaide Hamilton, wife of a local judge, wrote to her sister in Savannah that the young Frenchwoman exercised an unhealthy influence over the Granger heir. She noted that Elias had begun declining social invitations and seemed preoccupied with matters he refused to discuss. The Hamilton family's concerns were not merely social in nature. Judge Robert Hamilton had been a close friend of Elias's father and felt a responsibility to guide the young man. When he attempted to speak with Elias about his courtship, the conversation reportedly ended abruptly, with young Granger stating that there were aspects of family history that the judge would prefer not to examine too closely. During this same period, several disturbing incidents occurred around the Granger plantation. The plantation's blacksmith, a free man named Joshua Carter, reported that his tools had been moved during the night, specifically items used for removing shackles and restraints. When questioned about who might have access to his workshop, Carter could only say that someone with detailed knowledge of metalworking had been present. The enslaved population on the Granger plantation numbered 43 individuals, according to the 1849 census. Among them was an elderly woman named Celia, who had been purchased by Elias's grandfather in 1825. According to oral accounts preserved by her descendants and documented by historians in the early 1900s, Celia possessed knowledge of events from the plantation's earliest days that made certain family members uncomfortable. A letter from Elias Granger to his cousin William in Charleston, dated August 28, 1849, mentioned his discovery of documents in his father's private papers that shed new light on the circumstances surrounding several slave deaths that had occurred in the 1830s. The letter indicated that these documents contradicted official records and suggested that some deaths had been deliberately misrepresented to avoid legal complications. It was during the first week of September that the situation took a more serious turn. Mrs. Mills reported to Henri Rousseau that Evangeline had failed to return home after claiming she was visiting the Miller family on the outskirts of town. When Henri contacted the Millers, they stated they had not seen Evangeline in several weeks. A search was organized, but no trace of the young woman could be found. 2 days later, Elias Granger was discovered unconscious near the Hartwell cabin by a group of field workers. Dr. Hayes was summoned and found that the young man had suffered what appeared to be a severe blow to the head. When Granger regained consciousness, he claimed to have no memory of how he had sustained the injury or why he was in that location. His only coherent statement was a repeated insistence that certain documents needed to be destroyed before they could cause additional harm. The Leon County Sheriff, James Crawford, conducted an investigation into Evangeline's disappearance and Elias's injury. His report, filed on September 10, 1849, noted several peculiar findings. Inside the Hartwell cabin, investigators discovered evidence that the space had been used recently, including ashes in the fireplace and candle wax on the window sills. More significantly, they found pages from what appeared to be official documents, torn and partially burned. Among the remnants of these papers, several fragments could still be read. These included portions of bills of sale for enslaved individuals, but with prices and names that did not match any records in the county courthouse. There were also fragments of letters written in French, though they were too damaged to read in their entirety. The most disturbing discovery was a partial list of names, all of enslaved individuals, with dates beside them that corresponded to the years 1832 through 1834. Dr. Hayes's medical examination of Elias Granger revealed injuries consistent with being struck by a heavy object, though the physician noted that the pattern of wounds was unusual. There were marks on the young man's wrists that suggested he had been restrained, though Granger maintained that he could not recall any such incident. More puzzling was the presence of what appeared to be old scars on his hands and forearms, scars that Dr. Hayes had not observed during previous examinations. The search for Evangeline Rousseau continued for several weeks, with volunteers combing the forests and swamplands surrounding Tallahassee. Bloodhounds were brought in from Georgia, but they lost the scent near the banks of Lake Jackson, approximately 6 miles north of the Granger plantation. Local residents reported no sightings of the young woman, despite the substantial reward offered by her father. During this period, Henri Rousseau became increasingly desperate. According to records from the First National Bank of Tallahassee, he liquidated his remaining assets and hired a private investigator from Jacksonville to assist in the search. This investigator, a former Pinkerton agent named Marcus Webb, arrived in Tallahassee on September 20th and immediately began interviewing slaves and free blacks in the area. Webb's methods were more thorough than those employed by local authorities. He discovered that several enslaved individuals from neighboring plantations had observed unusual activity around the Hartwell cabin during the summer months. These witnesses, speaking under conditions of promised anonymity, described seeing figures moving between the cabin and the main Granger house during the darkest hours of night. More significantly, they reported hearing sounds from the cabin that suggested someone was being held there against their will. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Webb interviewed Celia, the elderly enslaved woman from the Granger plantation. According to Webb's notes, which were discovered in 1867 among papers donated to the state archives, Celia revealed that she'd been instructed by Elias Granger to prepare food and water for someone being kept in the cabin. She claimed that young Granger had told her this was necessary to protect his family from scandal, though she was not told the identity of the person being concealed. More troubling was Celia's account of documents that Elias had shown her, documents that she said contained the names of enslaved individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances during his father's lifetime. According to Celia, these documents suggested that some deaths had been deliberately caused to prevent certain slaves from revealing information about illegal activities conducted on the plantation. Webb's investigation also uncovered evidence that the Rousseau family's financial difficulties were more severe than publicly known. Bank records showed that Henri had borrowed money from several local creditors, using his daughter's potential marriage prospects as collateral. More significantly, Webb discovered that Henri had been in correspondence with plantation owners in Louisiana about the possibility of selling Evangeline into what he euphemistically termed a household arrangement that would resolve his debts. The true nature of the relationship between Elias Granger and Evangeline Rousseau began to emerge through Webb's methodical investigation. Rather than a conventional courtship, the evidence suggested that Elias had been attempting to protect Evangeline from her father's financial schemes while simultaneously concealing his own family's dark history. The meetings at the Hartwell cabin were not romantic encounters, but rather desperate attempts to find a solution to problems that threatened to destroy both families. Elias's head injury had not been the result of an attack by an unknown assailant as initially believed. Webb's investigation revealed that the young man had been struck down by his own overseer, Thomas Wickham, who had discovered Elias attempting to destroy plantation records that documented decades of illegal activities. These activities included the deliberate killing of enslaved individuals who possessed knowledge of the plantation's involvement in smuggling operations that had continued long after such activities had been prohibited by federal law. The torn documents found in the Hartwell cabin were not random papers, but rather evidence that Elias had been attempting to expose his family's crimes. The list of names with dates represented enslaved individuals who had been murdered to maintain silence about the plantation's illegal operations. Evangeline Rousseau had become involved not as a romantic partner, but as someone who possessed the education and language skills necessary to translate and understand documents that revealed the full scope of the Granger family's criminal activities. Webb's investigation revealed that Evangeline's disappearance was not a random event, but rather a carefully planned elimination. Thomas Wickham, acting under instructions from powerful families who would be implicated if the truth became known, had silenced both Evangeline and the enslaved witnesses who could corroborate her claims. The young woman's body was never found, but Webb's notes suggested that she had been killed and her remains disposed of in one of the many sinkholes that dotted the Leon County landscape. The investigators' final report, submitted to Henri Rousseau on November 15, 1849, concluded that his daughter had uncovered evidence of systematic murder and exploitation that extended far beyond the Granger plantation. Multiple prominent families were implicated in a network of illegal activities that had generated substantial profits while claiming the lives of dozens of enslaved individuals who knew too much. Henri Rousseau was found dead in his home 3 days after receiving Webb's report. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Dr. Hayes noted in his private records that the man showed signs of poisoning. No investigation was conducted into Henry's death, and Webb left Tallahassee immediately afterward, taking his detailed notes with him. Elias Granger recovered from his injuries, but never spoke publicly about the events of September 1849. He sold the plantation within 6 months and moved to California, where he lived quietly until his death in 1873. Before leaving Tallahassee, he arranged for the manumission of all enslaved individuals on his property, an unusual action that attracted considerable attention but no official comment. The Hartwell cabin was destroyed by fire in December of 1849. Local residents reported that the blaze occurred during a windless night, suggesting that it had been deliberately set. No investigation was conducted, and the site was eventually absorbed into the surrounding forest. For decades afterward, local children avoided the area, claiming that they could still hear voices calling from beneath the earth. The records of Webb's investigation disappeared from official archives sometime during the 1860s. However, copies had been made and hidden by allies of the abolitionist movement. These documents surfaced briefly in 1897 during a historical research project conducted by faculty from Florida State College. but they were quickly suppressed by families whose ancestors were implicated in the crimes described. Thomas Wickham continued as an overseer on various plantations until 1857, when he died under circumstances that were never fully explained. Workers found his body floating in the Ochlockonee River with injuries that could not be attributed to drowning. No one was ever charged in connection with his death, though oral traditions among the African American community suggested that justice had finally been served. Celia, the elderly enslaved woman who had provided crucial information to Webb, lived until 1868. According to accounts preserved by her descendants, she maintained until her death that the spirits of those who had been murdered on the Granger plantation would not rest until the truth was fully revealed. She claimed that on quiet nights she could hear them calling from the depths of the earth, demanding recognition and justice. The site of the former Granger plantation was eventually sold and subdivided. By the early 1900s, suburban homes occupied the land where cotton fields once stretched. However, residents of these homes reported unusual phenomena: voices heard during twilight hours, the sound of footsteps on the wooden floors when no one was present, and the persistent smell of smoke that could not be traced to any source. Local historians who attempted to research the events of 1849 found that crucial documents had been systematically removed from archives throughout the region. Court records, plantation documents, and even church registers from that period showed clear signs of tampering. Pages had been torn out, entries had been deliberately obscured, and entire volumes had disappeared from collections that had once been considered complete. The Leon County Historical Society received an anonymous donation in 1961 that included photocopies of portions of Webb's investigation. These documents provided the first concrete evidence of the true nature of the events surrounding Evangeline Rousseau's disappearance. However, efforts to publish this information were met with legal challenges from families who claimed that the allegations were unsubstantiated and potentially libelous. Dr. Patricia Williams, a historian from Florida A&M University, conducted extensive research into the case during the 1950s. Her work, based on newly discovered slave narratives and oral histories preserved within the African American community, painted a detailed picture of the systematic violence that had been concealed for over a century. Dr. Williams's research revealed that the Granger plantation murders were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation and violence that extended throughout the antebellum period. The oral traditions maintained by descendants of enslaved families provided details that had never appeared in official records. These accounts described secret burial grounds where victims had been hastily interred, hidden chambers beneath plantation houses where evidence had been concealed, and coded messages that had been used to warn potential victims of impending danger. The stories passed down through generations painted a picture of organized resistance to the violence, with enslaved individuals working together to document crimes and protect potential witnesses. Archaeological investigations conducted in the area during the 1960s uncovered evidence that supported these oral accounts. Excavations near the site of the former Hartwell cabin revealed artifacts, including personal items that had belonged to enslaved individuals, fragments of documents that had been buried rather than burned, and human remains that showed signs of violent death. However, these discoveries were not made public, and the excavation sites were quickly covered and developed for commercial use. The final pieces of the puzzle emerged from an unexpected source in 1967. During renovation of an antebellum mansion in the Calhoun Street Historic District, workers discovered a hidden compartment containing documents that had been concealed for over a century. These papers included letters written by Evangeline Rousseau to contacts in the abolitionist movement, detailing her discoveries about the Granger plantation and her plans to expose the truth about the murders that had been committed there. Evangeline's letters revealed that she had not been a victim of circumstances, but rather an active investigator who had deliberately cultivated her relationship with Elias Granger to gain access to incriminating documents. Her education and language skills had made her valuable to abolitionist networks that were working to document and expose the crimes being committed against enslaved populations throughout the South. The romantic narrative that had surrounded her relationship with Elias was largely a fiction created to provide cover for her investigative activities. The letters also revealed that Evangeline had been in contact with other investigators working in different parts of the South, sharing information about criminal networks that extended far beyond individual plantations. Her work was part of a coordinated effort to gather evidence that could be used to support legal challenges to slavery and to document crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden forever. More significantly, the letters indicated that Evangeline had been aware of the danger she faced and had made preparations for her own protection. She had arranged for copies of crucial documents to be sent to allies in the North and had established code words that could be used to alert her contacts if she found herself in immediate peril. The fact that she had ultimately been silenced suggested that her opponents had been more ruthless and better organized than she had anticipated. The discovery of these letters prompted a renewed investigation into the events of 1849. But this investigation was quickly terminated when several prominent families threatened legal action. The documents were acquired by a private collector and removed from public access, though copies had been made and preserved by researchers who recognized their historical significance. By the early 1970s, the true story of Evangeline Rousseau and Elias Granger had begun to emerge from the carefully constructed fiction that had concealed it for over a century. Rather than a tragic romance, their relationship represented a complex intersection of abolitionist investigation, family secrets, and organized efforts to suppress evidence of systematic murder. Evangeline's fate had been sealed, not by romantic entanglement, but by her success in uncovering evidence that threatened powerful interests throughout the region. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The network of criminal activity that Evangeline had begun to expose represented a systematic pattern of violence and exploitation that had been concealed through the destruction of records, the silencing of witnesses, and the careful manipulation of official narratives. Her murder and the subsequent cover-up demonstrated the lengths to which powerful families would go to protect their interests and preserve their version of history. The legacy of these events continued to influence the Tallahassee community well into the modern era. Families whose ancestors had been involved in the crimes maintained their silence, while descendants of the victims continued to preserve oral traditions that kept the truth alive within their communities. The tension between official history and suppressed truth created a persistent undercurrent of unresolved trauma that affected the community for generations. Urban development in the areas where these events had occurred was marked by persistent problems that defied easy explanation. Construction projects frequently encountered unexpected difficulties, including the discovery of unmarked graves, structural problems that could not be attributed to normal causes, and reports of unusual phenomena that drove workers from job sites. These incidents were typically attributed to natural causes or construction errors, but the pattern suggested deeper issues that remained unresolved. The efforts to suppress the true story of Evangeline Rousseau ultimately failed to completely erase the evidence of what had occurred. Despite the systematic destruction of documents and the silencing of witnesses, fragments of truth survived in hidden archives, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence that gradually emerged over the decades following the initial crimes. The story that had been buried beneath layers of official deception slowly reconstructed itself through the patient work of historians and the determination of communities to preserve their own memories. Today, the sites where these events occurred show no obvious signs of their traumatic history. Suburban neighborhoods, shopping centers, and office buildings occupy the land where cotton fields once stretched and where enslaved families lived and died. The Hartwell cabin site is now a small park, with no historical marker to indicate what occurred there. Visitors to the area report an inexplicable sense of unease, a feeling that something important remains unfinished. Recent genealogical research has revealed connections between the families involved in these events and prominent political and business leaders throughout Florida's subsequent history. The wealth accumulated through illegal activities during the antebellum period provided the foundation for family fortunes that continue to influence state politics and economics. The silence that protected these families in 1849 has largely been maintained into the present day, though cracks in the facade continue to appear as new evidence emerges. The story of Evangeline Rousseau serves as a reminder that the official narratives preserved in historical records often conceal as much as they reveal. The young French woman who disappeared from Tallahassee in 1849 was not the victim of a failed romance, but rather a casualty in a much larger struggle between those who profited from systematic oppression and those who risked everything to expose the truth. Her courage in confronting powerful interests ultimately cost her life, but her work contributed to a broader understanding of the crimes that were committed in the name of preserving an economic system built on human suffering. The case also demonstrates the lengths to which communities will go to protect comfortable myths about their past. The romantic narrative that obscured the true nature of Evangeline's relationship with Elias Granger was more palatable than the reality of systematic murder and organized cover-up. By focusing attention on individual tragedy rather than systemic crime, this false narrative allowed the community to avoid confronting the deeper implications of what had occurred. The persistence of unexplained phenomena at sites connected to these events suggests that some wounds never fully heal. The voices heard by children playing near the former Hartwell cabin site, the persistent reports of unusual occurrences at homes built on former plantation land, and the difficulty encountered by construction projects in certain areas all point to a community that has never fully processed the trauma of its past. Until the full truth is acknowledged and the victims properly honored, these reminders of unfinished business will likely continue to surface. The documentation that survived despite efforts to destroy it provides a window into a world where human beings were treated as expendable commodities and where their lives could be ended with impunity to protect the interests of their owners. The courage shown by individuals like Evangeline Rousseau and Elias Granger in attempting to expose these crimes, even at great personal cost, offers hope that truth can ultimately emerge despite powerful efforts to suppress it. The case remains officially unresolved, with no charges ever filed in connection with the murders that were documented in Evangeline's letters and Webb's investigation. The statute of limitations has long since expired, and most of the direct participants are long dead. However, the moral debt created by these crimes has never been acknowledged, and the families who benefited from the systematic exploitation of enslaved labor have never been held accountable for their ancestors' actions. For the descendants of those who were murdered to maintain silence about illegal activities, the case represents an ongoing injustice that extends far beyond the events of 1849. The suppression of evidence, the destruction of records, and the creation of false narratives denied them the opportunity to properly grieve their ancestors and to understand the circumstances of their deaths. The preservation of oral traditions within these communities represents an act of resistance against efforts to erase their history and deny them recognition as victims of systematic violence. The story continues to resonate because it illuminates broader questions about how societies choose to remember their past and which narratives they preserve for future generations. The tension between official history and suppressed truth reflects ongoing struggles over memory, identity, and accountability that extend far beyond the specific events that occurred in Tallahassee during the summer of 1849. The voices that still echo from that distant time serve as reminders that some truths are too important to be silenced, regardless of how much time has passed or how powerful the interests that seek to suppress them. And perhaps, on quiet evenings, when the Spanish moss sways in the Florida breeze, those who listen carefully might still hear the whispers of those who died with their stories untold, their voices joining across the years to demand that the truth finally be acknowledged and their sacrifice properly honored. The mystery of Evangeline Rousseau and Elias Granger was never really about romance at all. It was about courage, justice, and the price paid by those who dared to speak truth to power in a world determined to silence them forever. The investigations that began in the 1960s gradually faded as the original researchers aged and died. Dr. Patricia Williams's work was never published in its complete form, though excerpts appeared in academic journals that few people read. The families whose ancestors had been implicated in the crimes successfully maintained their silence, using legal threats and social pressure to discourage further inquiry. By 1968, most of the physical evidence had been destroyed or made inaccessible. The archaeological sites were covered with concrete and asphalt, the documents were locked away in private collections, and the witnesses who might have provided additional testimony had passed away. The window for achieving any form of official recognition or justice gradually closed as time eliminated both evidence and opportunity. The oral traditions preserved within African American families remained the primary repository of truth about the events. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who had witnessed the crimes continued to pass down the stories, even as the broader community chose to forget. These family narratives preserved details that appeared in no official record, the names of specific victims, the locations where bodies had been buried, and the methods used to silence those who knew too much. In 1969, the last surviving witness to the events of 1849 died quietly in a nursing home outside Jacksonville. Martha Washington had been 7 years old when Evangeline Rousseau disappeared, but her memories of that summer remained vivid until her final days. She told her granddaughter that she had seen the young French woman being forced into a wagon near the Hartwell cabin, and that she had heard her screaming until the wagon disappeared into the forest. Martha had never spoken of what she witnessed, knowing that such testimony from a child would not have been believed and might have endangered her own family. The site of the former Granger plantation underwent its final transformation in the early 1970s, when a shopping center was constructed over the area where the main house had once stood. During excavation for the foundation, workers uncovered what appeared to be a family cemetery, but the graves were hastily relocated without proper documentation. Local residents reported that construction equipment frequently broke down during the project, and several workers quit after experiencing what they described as overwhelming feelings of dread while working on the site. The shopping center that eventually opened on the site struggled with persistent problems that defied explanation. Businesses failed at an unusually high rate, employees reported feeling uncomfortable during certain shifts, and customers complained about strange sounds and unexplained cold spots throughout the building. The property changed hands multiple times over the following decades, with each new owner attempting unsuccessfully to address the underlying issues that seemed to plague the location. By the mid-1970s, the story of Evangeline Rousseau had largely faded from public memory. The few historians who still researched the case found that crucial sources continued to disappear from archives, and attempts to interview elderly residents were met with silence or claims of ignorance. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the perpetrators in 1849 proved remarkably durable, surviving multiple generations and maintaining its effectiveness well into the modern era. The case serves as a stark reminder of how effectively truth can be suppressed when powerful interests coordinate their efforts to control the historical narrative. Despite the courage of individuals like Evangeline Rousseau, who risked everything to expose systematic crimes, their sacrifice was ultimately rendered meaningless by the ability of their opponents to destroy evidence, silence witnesses, and create alternative explanations that served their interests. Today, visitors to Tallahassee can find no official commemoration of Evangeline Rousseau or acknowledgement of the crimes that cost her life. The historical markers that dot the city focus on more palatable aspects of the past, celebrating political achievements and architectural landmarks while maintaining silence about the systematic violence that occurred beneath the surface of antebellum society. The young woman who died attempting to document and expose murder has been erased from official memory as thoroughly as if she had never existed. Yet on certain evenings, when the wind moves through the oak trees that still shade parts of the old plantation lands, some claim they can hear voices calling across the years. Whether these sounds represent the persistence of unresolved trauma, the power of community memory, or simply the natural acoustics of the landscape, they serve as reminders that some stories refuse to remain buried, regardless of how much effort has been invested in suppressing them. The mystery of what happened during that summer of 1849 was never truly a mystery at all. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of violence and deception that succeeded in its immediate goals, but ultimately failed to completely erase the evidence of what had occurred. The truth survived in fragments. Hidden documents, oral traditions, and archaeological remains that gradually emerged despite systematic efforts to destroy them. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire case is not the violence that was committed, but the success with which it was concealed. The families responsible for multiple murders continued to prosper. Their descendants inherited both wealth and influence built on systematic exploitation, and the community as a whole chose comfortable lies over difficult truths. The voices that still echo from that distant summer serve as testament to the cost of such choices and to the persistence of truth even when it has been buried beneath layers of official deception. And in the end, the silence that was supposed to protect powerful interests may have become their greatest burden, for it ensured that the crimes they committed would never be fully resolved and that their victims would never truly rest in peace.